Hello, everyone. Delighted to have you back at the Women in Public Policy Program seminar series of this spring. And I'm happy to say, because we are in Boston, Massachusetts here, spring has finally arrived today. And I know this is not the case for many of you who are in warmer climates and don't have to worry about that, but it is in that sense a lovely day for us. So I co-direct the Women in Public Policy Program, and I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School. This seminar series focuses on making work fair. And for those of you who are joining along and reading along in our book, Make Work Fair, this is related to chapters 11 and 12, where we try to better understand how norms emerge and how culture emerges, which is why Professor Aneja's presentation today is so timely. So Abhay Aneja is a professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's going to talk to us about the intergenerational effects of World War I, so kind of long-term effects of people's experiences in World War I and how that affects gender dynamics and diversity dynamics in the workplace. Abhay is, as I said, at the UC California, Berkeley, and he is a lawyer and a quantitative social scientist who studies how legal institutions affect social inequality and development. As typical for our seminars, our speakers will present for about 30 to 40 minutes, so we have some time at the end to ask questions. However, Abhay also invites questions during his talk, so feel free to add particularly clarifying questions into the Q&A function on your Zoom, and I will try to watch out for them and make sure that we get to clarifying questions before the end of the talk. And with that, please join me in very warmly welcoming Professor Aneja to the Women in Public Policy Program seminar.
Thanks, Iris. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, if that's okay. I think the slides should be up now.
Yeah, perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it's great. It's so wonderful to be here. So, Iris, thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, and I'll go ahead and dive right in. And I should just mention this is joint work with my terrific colleagues here at Berkeley, Guo Shu, who is teaches at the High School of Business, and a really, really terrific graduate student at the business school, Sylvia Farina. And the big picture motivation for this project is that we're trying to understand or to contribute to our understanding of the roots of economic disparities along gender lines, in particular within the employment context in this project. And, you know, I think there's growing consensus, at least to suggest that attitudes towards women's work and social norms, or at least one factor that can shape gender gaps and outcomes that we care about, like employment. And in our context, I'm going to define gender norms broadly as just beliefs about the extent to which women can and should. Now, one approach to ameliorating disparities, in part by focusing on changing attitudes, has centered on increasing gender representation and inclusion in various settings. For instance, researchers have shown now that exposure to women, both within the workplace or in public office, can normalize female work and leadership, change aspirations of future generations, and even potentially shape future economic decisions. But to our minds, at least, there's relatively little evidence on whether the effects of increased gender representation diffuse more broadly and persistently across generations in space. So what we're going to do in this paper is to bring some evidence to bear on this question of the intergenerational effects of contact in the workplace by studying the sudden influx of women into by studying how a sudden influx of women into the workplace had the potential to change labor force participation for future generations of women. And the way we're going to do this is by documenting the effects of the rapid hiring of women that occurred during World War I. So I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but what we're going to leverage is the fact that after a sustained period of being essentially closed off to women during the 19th century, America's entrance into World War I essentially opened the doors to female participation as civil servants in the US, more or less for the first time. And using the fact that the war created a rapid expansion of the female workforce, we're going to try and document this episode's effects on gender norms within both the civil service and more broadly. And we're going to do that using a variety of data sources that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And just to summarize, what we do, and I'll cover this in the talk, we're going to use a few different sources of historical data, in particular, some pretty high frequency data on government personnel, to try and show three main things in the project. So first, we're going to show that World War I basically doubled the size of the female workforce basically overnight. Second, we're going to show that this doubling exposed mainly male incumbent civil servants to many more female co-workers, which we think changed norms towards women's work and increased the likelihood that the daughters of those male civil servants who were exposed to women in the workplace to work in adulthood. And then finally, we're going to show that this exposure to gender diversity, to women in the workforce, not only affected the families of incumbent workers, but had spillover effects within local communities as well. So we're going to show that the sudden influx of female federal employees not only had effects on the kids of civil servants, but also spillovers to the communities in which those people lived. So that's kind of at a high level, what I'm gonna cover in the talk. Okay, so let me just talk for a brief moment about where the project fits in, and I won't spend too much time here because there are so many people who have contributed in the literatures that we're working in. But first, and perhaps most importantly, we think this project continues to research on the determinants of economic disparities along gender lines. Second, we think our project contributes to research on how attitudes change through greater exposure and contact to different and potentially new groups. And then finally, consistent with sort of the theme of the workshop, we think this is a project that contributes to an understanding of how norms change in the economy and socially. So that's kind of where we see this project fitting in. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about the context of our study. So the turn of the 19th century was a time during which women, as you can see in the figure, were already increasingly entering the labor market. This was especially true within jobs that we think about as white-collar clerical jobs. So between the end of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, the fraction of clerical workers that were women within the labor force increased almost tenfold. And it's against this backdrop of women entering, in particular, white-collar work that the U.S. entered World War I. Now, during the war, the size of the federal government expanded rapidly. And one reason for this was the increased need for particular types of government workers, like typists, bookkeepers, clerks. And because this demand for clerical workers was so urgent, the government essentially, and the departure of so many men to participate in the war effort on the front lines, the government was essentially forced to open many jobs to women for essentially the first time. And so the first thing we're going to do in this project is really try and document then that World War I really was kind of what we might think about as a critical juncture in terms of the history of the federal government and the role of women as public servants. And what I'm showing here on the slide is that if it's just sort of looking at census data uh, and the fraction of civil servants who are women, and what you see is that there's a pretty discrete jump that's occurring between 1910 and 1920 in terms of the presence of women within federal government work. But of course, a lot of things could be happening over the course of decades. And so what we're going to try and do in the first part of the project is be a little bit more rigorous about pinning this change in trajectory to a specific historical episode, which is the entrance of the US into World War I. So let me talk a little bit then about the data that we use to get there, to sort of document the rise of female clerks within the federal workforce.
Abhay, can I interrupt you for a second
Of
before you
course,
go into
yeah,
data? Because we've had two questions already. One is a little bit bigger one, and one is just more a clarification question. And that is, so we are talking specifically about the US, specifically about the civil service here. So that's kind of the question, yeah.
So sorry, can you say
But the
one more?
question is, right, I'm going to read it. Are we talking about influences over the world or only in the US? I think we're talking only in the US.
That's great. So our paper you can think about as being sort of a case study looking at specifically the expansion of women in the workplace within the U.S. government. I will just say, while this is a paper that's about the U.S., you can see that the sort of increased presence of women as part of the clerical workforce was sort of happening in other Western democracies. And so, you can certainly read accounts, I think, of what feel like sort of similar phenomena in places like the UK and France and potentially other places. But this is a paper that's going to focus on this.
Okay, that's actually related to the first question that was asked that I initially wanted to defer, but it's very related to the discussion we're having now, so we might have it right now. So it appears as if you would think we might have had similar dynamics in other countries involved in the war, potentially even more pronounced because some of these countries have been in the war longer than the US. We don't know that, but yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I think we'll get, I have a few questions here specifically about sample size, etc. I think we'll get to the data in just a moment. Can I ask a personal question actually quickly? Because you, I mean, personal, it's not personal, but just my question. Because you mentioned kind of this was such an extraordinary moment in history. And I know other papers have looked at the influence of World War II on women's workforce participation. So would you say World War I was in some ways more significant because it might have been this first mover getting women into the workforce, or are we seeing similar effects from World War II?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think we're still trying to work out for ourselves. What makes World War I different from World War II? Unfortunately, I think I'm going to need to. I don't have a sort of. That's something that I'm still. I think we're still working on. One thing, one difference that I think just sort of makes our project a little bit different than some of the really important work that's documented the role of War II is that we're really focusing on sort of the role of the federal government as an employer in this project, and most of the work, at least that I'm familiar with, that looks at the impact of World War II on drawing women into the workforce is focused on the economy as a whole, but by implication, given sort of the relatively small size of the federal government, is really a story about the about sort of private sector mobilization for the war effort. One thing that I do think is just sort of different, although I don't think I don't think it's, I would go so far as to say it's more significant, is that, the World War I really was, it seems, sort of a turning point in terms of the size of the administrative state. Um, and so I think that did provide um, opportunities then for employment that women were particularly well suited to, given sort of the background, sort of increasing presence of women in white collar clerical. And
Okay.
so again, I don't think that I don't think we can say, and it may well not be the case, that World War I is more significant as a whole. But I think it's possible that World War I was a turning point in terms of providing women opportunities as civil servants, given that they
Mhm.
were more or less, as we'll show, were a much smaller fraction of the government workforce.
Thank you.
Should I keep going questions, or should we sort of wait until the end?
I think, please go ahead.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure. Okay, great. So the main source of data for our project are going to be about 15 years worth of information from a government source called the United States Official Register. This is a data set that Guo and I have used across a couple of projects, and essentially what the registers are essentially complete rosters of every federal government employee working nationwide, and that person's position within the government. This was a volume that started being issued by the Census Bureau in the early 19th century, and it stopped being issued because of the size of the government in 1921. And I'll give you a sense of what these records look like in just a few minutes and what we sort of digitize. But then we'll also rely on census records to study the outcomes of kids of civil servants. But sort of to give you a sense of kind of how we're sort of constructing our data set on personnel, we were sort of digitizing records that look something like this. So this is just an example of one part of one page of one issue of the United States Official Register, the one from 1919. And on a page like this, there are information for about 200 individuals, 2 columns of about 100 people to each page. And here I'm showing you 1 column's worth of about 20 people. And so what we basically did here was to digitize everyone that you see, enumerated on pages like this. And I've sort of highlighted here in red the entry for one particular person, a person by the name of Vera Adams. And what you can see is that, just in this one line and half a page, a half a page's worth of information, we can glean quite a lot of sort of background about a person. So this is a person whose name was Vera Adams. We see that she worked in the War Department. We see that she worked within the War Department in the office of the chief signal officer. Her job was as a clerk. We also see her salary, and then we have a little bit of biographical information. So the state and congressional district, the state in which she was born, as well as the congressional district from which she was appointed, and the place of her work. So in this case, Vera Adams was both born in DC and worked in DC. And so we're essentially sort of creating a data set of everyone who worked in the federal government based on information that looks something like this. Now, one thing you might notice here is that within these records, we can't consistently observe a person's sex or gender. So in some cases, you can see identifiers like Miss. So Miss Thea Adams is the 4th person down. But Vera Adams, we also know was likely to be a woman for reasons I'll get to right now. But we're not consistently observing a worker's sex. And so what we'll do when sex is not reported, we're going to sort of we're going to do two things that we think are relatively intuitive to overcome this limitation of the data. First, we're just going to use first names to predict a worker's likely sex. And then second, we're going to focus on the subset of workers as a robustness check that we can match exactly to the 1910 population census. And so we know their sex based on the census manuscripts. So that's kind of an overview of the main data set. And using this data set, we're going to begin by showing a sharp increase in the hiring of civil servants that occurred, right around the onset of World War. And so what we see here on the figure I'm showing on the slide is that government employment was relatively stable from 1907 to 1917, when the U.S. Enters World War I. But between 1917 and 1919, 1917 being the year that the U.S. enters the conflict, we see that the size of the bureaucracy, the size of the federal government expands quite rapidly from, around 1.5 or 150 million workers to about to over 3 million by 1919. So we see that government is 300,000 workers, 150,000 to 300,000 workers by 1919. And the other thing I want to sort of notice here, or that I want to note here, is that the growth in this the growth in the size of government is actually somewhat persistent even after the war ends. So by 1921, the U.S. The war has ended, but the size of the federal government is still remained higher than the pre-1917 level. Even a few years after the war concluded. And we can see that this sort of growth is persistent by sort of using census data. Those are the gray squares here, sort of an alternate data source, to see that even looking at census data going out as far as 1930, the size of the federal government is despite there being some contraction, at a level that's higher than the pre-war era. Now, what about the gender composition of the bureaucracy and the gender composition of this sort of bureaucratic growth? So the key point I want to emphasize on this slide, and that emerges from this figure, is that when we break down government growth by gender composition, we see that World War I really seems to represent a turning point. We think, in the employment of women. Again, we see that the share of female workers between 1913 and 1917 is relatively stable. But once the U.S. enters World War I, the size, or the fraction rather, of women essentially doubles as well, increasing from about 13% to over 25%. And that's true. And we see that sort of increase in the fraction of women, whether or not we sort of look at our sort of predicted measure of worker sex, or our more exact measure of worker sex that relies on sort of these exact census linkages. And so again, this suggests to us that World War I really, might be kind of a turning point when it comes to women's employment in the civil service. And then the third thing I want to highlight, just descriptively here, is that, this growth in the share of women is really being driven by certain types of jobs, in particular by clerical jobs. And to see this, we kind of break down the expansion that I showed on the previous two slides by a coarse notion of occupation, which is clerical versus non-clerical jobs. And so in the left-hand panel, what we're seeing here is that looking at the overall growth of government, there's a larger expansion of clerical jobs than there are for other types of jobs. Clerical jobs being the bottom time series. And then finally, when we examine the gender composition of the clerical versus non-clerical positions, so that's what I'm showing here in panel B. the expansion of the female workforce, which I showed on the previous slide, seems to be driven almost entirely by government clerks. So the share of women in the federal clerical workforce jumps from around 25% to about 70%, again, just within 2 years. And this, we think, is quite consistent with sort of a related historical literature that's out there, which is that, given the background of women increasingly entering the white-collar labor force at the turn of the century, this expansion of wartime positions opened new opportunities for women to work as civil servants. So again, just to summarize, we think that this data provides at least suggestive evidence that World War I really was kind of a tipping point in terms of women's service in the U.S. And so given this big change in gender composition, we really wanted to try and understand the consequences in terms of attitudes towards women in the workforce. But before getting there, I did just want to sort of, briefly sort of touch on, a question that at least we had, an intermediate question, which is, did World War I change the type of women who became civil servants? So we also wanted to do some work to sort of characterize, who was being brought into the federal service, again, essentially for the first time. And the way we did this was by examining how the characteristics of female workers and male workers changed during the war, or the characteristics of female workers changed during the war relative to their male counterparts. And to sort of summarize, this part of the analysis, if we just sort of focus on column 4, which is telling us how the characteristics of female workers are changing during World War I relative to men, what we see is that, female workers were likely to be a little bit younger than their male counterparts. They were more likely to be single. And interesting, they were more likely to have, for example, more years of schooling. And so what this suggests to us, at least, is that World War I was bringing into the workforce sort of a group of likely more talented workers who were sort of previously, not a part of government service. Okay, so this sort of brings us to the main research question, which is, did the large influx of female servants change attitudes towards women's work? And the way we're going to formally think about this question is by thinking about whether the sudden change in the demographic composition of the workforce that I just showed, whether it changed the outcomes of the next generation or the children of federal government employees. And this is a tricky question to answer because World War I is a nationwide shock to the economy. And so the way we'll sort of operationalize this question is by relying on the fact that some government offices are going to be more exposed to demographic change than others, given the nature of the type of work being done. So, for example, because some offices, employed more clerical workers, for instance, they were more likely to hire more women during the war. Okay, and so just to be more formal about how we're going to do this, we're going to then define formally our measure of differential intensity or exposure of the sort of war-driven increase in women employees across cities and within departmental offices within our data. And so focusing on equation 1, our delta exposure term here, the left-hand side of the equation, the way that's going to be sort of our main variable of interest, which is sort of the change in the sort of exposure of civil servants to greater numbers of women. The way we're going to sort of define that is relatively straightforward. We're just going to sort of say that we're going to start with the fraction of women who work in a given Department J and City K in 1919, and we'll subtract from this the same value, the value of that same object before the war in 1915. So this is just capturing the change in the share of female civil servants within a given city and office during World War I. And so we'll use this quantity then to sort of study the intergenerational responses of civil servants in offices that were more and less affected by the sudden influx of women into the government workforce. And then using these office level differences in exposure to women within the government, equation 2 here is going to lay out our main approach to sort of testing our main hypothesis. And what we're doing here is relating then the outcomes that we care about. That's this Y variable on the left-hand side, and our main outcome is whether or not kids participated in the labor force. We're going to relate this outcome then to sort of the change in the share of civil servants during World War I. That's, again, our delta exposure measure. And then finally, because what we're really interested here is changing gender attitudes towards women's work over the long run, we're going to be focused here on whether parental investments change outcomes for daughters relative to sons. And so that's why we're looking at the interaction then of our delta exposure term and a dummy variable for whether a child is a female or not. And so what we really care about then in this regression equation is the beta 3 term that I've highlighted in blue, which is capturing how exposure to more female coworkers differentially affects daughters relative to sons. And so if there's sort of a gender-specific transmission of norms that we think is working, we'd expect this beta 3 term to be positive. And so that's kind of in a nutshell our regression. And so using this,
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question.
Sure.
I mean, you're very clear here. It's parents' exposure to female coworkers. We're not interested in whether that was the father or the mother who was exposed to female coworkers.
I'm sorry, my volume is a little bit soft. Can you say that a little bit one more time?
The question is, here on the slides, it says parents' exposure to female coworkers. So we don't care whether it is the mother or the father of the daughter who is exposed.
That is correct. That is correct. Now, I'm going to sort of focus on sort of looking at all civil servants, sort of all parents, rather, in these results. I should note that the overwhelming majority of incumbent civil servants that were in our sample are not, because again, between 5 or even less than 5% of civil servants before World War I were women. And so really this is a story about male civil servants being exposed to female workers and looking at how the daughters of those incumbent male civil servants, how their participation in the labor force changed over time. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I'm happy to take any other clarifying questions, because I know that was a little bit fast, but I'm also happy to sort of circle back in Q&A. Okay.
I think we're okay. I'm not seeing any other questions right now.
Great, terrific. So this table then sort of presents our main findings in a nutshell. And here, every column is going to represent a separate sort of variant of the regression I just presented on the previous slide. But just to summarize, and here you can sort of focus on the third row again, the sort of the delta exposure interacted with sort of female child variable. And what we're seeing here is consistent evidence that parental exposure to female civil servants during World War I increased the labor force participation of daughters in adulthood relative to sons in adulthood. So in other words, the female children of civil servants are relatively more likely to be working as adults in those offices that experienced greater increases in the fraction of federal workers that were. And so just to sort of interpret these estimates a little bit quantitatively, what we're seeing here is that a 1 standard deviation increase in a civil servant's exposure to women, which amounts to about a 10 percentage point change in the fraction of women, a 10% change in the fraction of women working within a government office leads to about a 2 to 4 percentage point increase in the likelihood of daughters working as adults. So column 1 sort of presents our baseline finding, and columns 2 and 3 we're just sort of stress testing this result and making this baseline specification sort of more demanding, if you will. Given sort of time limitations, I'm going to not sort of spend too much time on sort of the different subtle changes to the regression specification that we're making. But again, columns 2 and 3 kind of just highlight that, if anything, when we include more sort of potential confounders into our regression framework, our results look quite. We're consistently seeing that exposure to women, to female civil servants, is increasing the likelihood that the daughters of male civil servants, or primarily male civil servants, work in adulthood. Okay, again, that's kind of our main finding, but we also explored a few sources of heterogeneity just to better sort of understand what's going on. So let me talk just a little bit about some of those tests. So one concern that one may have is that there's something unique about the offices that hired more women, and that female wartime workers were more likely to select into more female-friendly offices in the first place. And so, this source of endogeneity would make it difficult then to sort of distinguish the causal effect of parental exposure to women from the fact that employees are just in more female-friendly offices that might generally transmit gender equal work norms to their children regardless. Now, one way we can try and rule this out is by looking at whether the exposure shock of World War I affected the children of civil servants who worked in offices that ultimately experienced that sort of shift in gender composition, but that left government before being exposed to female workers, because these were workers who left government service prior to World War I. And so that's what we'll sort of refer to, and to the left of the dotted line is our placebo sample. And what we're seeing here is that, again, all of our effect is being driven by parents, or by children of civil servants who were still in the government workforce during World War I when this change in composition occurred. If we sort of look at those kids whose parents worked in those offices prior to World War I, we don't see any effect of any increased likelihood of daughters to be working as adults. And so we think this, again, is consistent with the effect being or this sort of ameliorates our concerns about sort of these being sort of place offices that already had sort of gender egalitarian cultures, if you will. We think that what really seems to be evidence that there's something specific about the changing composition during the wartime period. Another source of heterogeneity that we examine is sort of the effect as a function of a child's age. And the motivation behind this test is that we might expect greater transmission of attitudes towards women's work for those daughters who are more likely to be living in the household at the time at which the U.S. entered World War I. And that's exactly what we observe here. If we sort of look at sort of the effects for daughters who had sort of aged out of the household by the time the government was the demographics of the government were changing, again, we see the effects are more muted. Okay, so again, our central finding is sort of focused on labor force participation for female children, but we also wanted to look at other outcomes that we thought might be related to women's labor force participation. And what we see in this table is additional evidence that we think is consistent with a change in gender norms over the long run, such as, for instance, lower rates of marriage for those women who are entering the labor force, as a lower likelihood of having of being a parent, at least in for women who are sort of in their 30s and in their sort of mid to late 30s in 1940. We don't actually see much evidence that sort of years of schooling is changing. which is what we show in column 3. Now, I'm happy to sort of talk about sort of some of the sort of robustness tests that we do to sort of convince ourselves that the core finding sort of holds up, as well as some of the other tests that we other sources of heterogeneity that we examined. The one thing I did want to sort of mention in terms of mechanisms is that so far, I've sort of been framed the talk about understanding increased labor force participation through the channel of sort of changing gender norms across generations. Sorry, did you? Okay.
So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I did want to quickly ask a clarifying question in the chat, and that is whether the dependent variable here is all workforce in the federal government or just clerical jobs.
Terrific question. So that's something that we talk about in the full version of the paper. But I think it's a really, but I had sort of glossed over for purpose of this presentation. Because of time. We are focused here on general labor force participation. It is true that the effect is slightly stronger if we look at government workforce participation, but we see also a significant increase in the likelihood of general labor force participation, which again sort of tells us something about the operative channel, we think at least, being something about norms change rather than sort of information that's specific to sort of the increased likelihood of or the increased opportunities within the government sector.
And then a more specific question is about the age of the children. You told us before that older daughters, I mean, meaning just a little older, like 25 and older, are less affected by the change because presumably they've already chosen careers or life paths. Did you also look at very young children, very young daughters, so who might have been 9, 10, 11, for whom education could have played a role still? Oh, here we go. Yeah,
that's right. And actually, yes, like exactly as you say, we again, consistent with education playing a little bit less of a role, we see the effects are also muted for very young
children. Okay. I mean, theoretically, one could have imagined that maybe parents would be more likely to then send their daughters to, longer lasting education, college, etc. But you didn't find that. I mean, not for everyone, but we were just thinking maybe the 10 to 14-year-olds might have had an impact on them, but you didn't find that.
Yeah, I think we thought that was quite plausible. One thing that we think may be going on here is that, again, during this particular time, federal government employees in general were more educated, and so we're already drawing from a more sort of what we might think about as a positively selected sort of part of the overall population distribution. And so, perhaps, these were kids who are already relatively more likely to become educated than the general population. And so sort of the potential margins of change are just a little bit smaller. But yeah, we thought that was plausible. We just don't really see it.
Okay. So before you got to the robustness checks, which I'd love to see, but I have to ask you a little bit of a bigger question,
sure.
Which I think is also going to be interesting for our audience. So generally, so Siri and I, when we wrote the book, Make Work Fair, we were a bit sad to learn that many of these experiments, which have been looking at cross-group exposure. And so think this is a bit of cross-group exposure, right? I'm thinking now fathers mainly, because most of these people were fathers. Yep. Fathers' exposure to women working affects how they treat their daughters, basically.
Yep.
And there's other research on fathers and daughters. So, okay, that's good. But, other research looking at, for example, gender diverse military groups. Boot camp, kind of randomly assigning women to males to men's teams, did have short-term effects, but not long-term effects.
Yeah.
So it didn't last very much. Why do you think, and this is a big question, I totally get it, but I find it very encouraging to see your results. But why do we think that type of, cross-group exposure mattered so much? Is it because the fathers of daughters is just a very special relation? I mean, obviously, a special relationship, or is there anything else that we should think about?
It's a really good question. And I assume here you might be talking about the paper that I know, I think is by
In Norway,
yes, yeah, okay, yeah, I think that's, but there might
for
be one
example,
I think there's even one in the US now, I think. I could
there
be,
are a number of papers kind of
okay,
looking at this
yeah,
also across races,
yeah,
ethnicities,
yeah,
religion, and also another good one is the assignment to dorm rooms,
yeah,
which of course doesn't look at gender, but looks at race
right.
differences. Anyway, yeah.
It's a really, it's a great question and a hard question, sort of, why we observe, how to sort of reconcile our findings with some of the studies that don't find, that either don't find effects or don't find persistent effects. I do think we need to do a little bit more work to sort of uh, reconcile our findings with other work. A couple of thoughts off the cuff, which I think again tend to be, you know, a little bit, you know, reasons for, pessimism, about this as sort of a general strategy. But nevertheless, I think may be important to sort of note, you know, war expansions are very sort of peculiar times in general, when, for example, there's almost no displacement of men from the workers, for instance. These were jobs that were essentially that weren't being filled, in fact, but before. And so some of the settings in which I think you might observe, null effects are settings in which there might be sort of competing sort of backlash type mechanisms operating. We think for the most part, these are the sorts of mechanisms that were less likely to operate in our setting. Yeah, so that's just an example, but
Mhm,
this is all
mhm.
just to say, I do think we need to do a little bit more to sort of reconcile, but I do think that our episode, the context of our study is pretty unique, and so before sort of projecting forward, with sort of policy implications, it's worth really sort of thinking hard about, whether what sort of features of the institutional environment sort of match, um, you know, current context.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you. Well, you're
Uh,
leaving us with some hope at least.
So yeah, I hope so. Okay. I know I wanted to make time for questions, so I'll just go quickly through a few more results, and then I'll open things up. As I mentioned, I've mainly been talking, about, our outcomes, as sort of representing a change in gender norms. Now, one concern you might have is that we're sort of, inferring norms change by looking at, sort of the outcomes of kids rather than the outcomes of the affected workers themselves. And in part, one reason for that is we just don't have a direct measure of affected workers' attitudes towards women in the workplace. But one way we can sort of complement our main results in a way that I think reinforces our interpretation is using a more direct outcome for affected civil servants rather than an outcome related to their children, which is the marriage choices of civil servants who weren't yet married and who were differentially exposed to female workers. So we ask whether more exposed male non-married civil servants were more likely to marry working women. And in part, this is sort of drawing on a literature that suggests that there was a certain sometimes a certain stigma associated with women who were already in the workplace during this time that sort of change their prospects in the marriage market. And what we see, in fact, is that for men who were exposed to this to increased numbers of female workers during World War I, they were in fact more likely to marry other working spouses, which we think is sort of evidence of changing gender norms. Importantly, what we see in column 2 here is that, this is all being driven by men who chose to marry after entering the war and becoming exposed to more females in the workforce. Okay, great. So I'll just use, I promise just 1 or 2 more minutes to talk about our sort of the final part of the paper, where we want to sort of go beyond the federal government and ask whether there were sort of aggregate effects of this economic shock to women's participation in the federal service. And so to this end, we sort of ask whether the increased entry of female civil servants had effects not just for the kids of civil servants, kids of civil servants, and rather for kids who were in the broader communities in which those civil servants worked. And so we asked whether cities then that experienced an increase in female representation in the government also see increases in overall increases in female labor force participation. Excuse me. To do this, then we sort of aggregate our city department level exposure to the full city level. And what I'm showing here on the figure on the right-hand side of the slide is that there's a fair amount of variation in terms of the change in female civil servant share looking across cities. And so we're going to leverage this cross-city variation in sort of a similar difference in difference style framework to measure how female labor force participation evolved in more versus less affected cities before and after World War I. What we see actually, again, is evidence sort of consistent with our main results, which are that, again, in the Black time series, what we're seeing is that, again, a pretty consistent increase in the likelihood that women were in the labor force in the decades after World War I concluded. And men were more or less unaffected, which we think we'd expect. And then finally, we think that this overall change in the aggregate employment of aggregate labor force participation of women is really being driven by sort of neighborhood level transmission of sort of norms around or attitudes towards women's work. And the reason that we think this is the case is that when we sort of separate out neighborhoods, and by neighborhoods I mean here enumeration districts, we see that those enumeration districts that had female in which there were large numbers of women entering the civil service, those are the neighborhoods in which you see greater likelihood, increased female labor force participation. Okay, so I'll go ahead and sort of end here and sort of reserve our remaining time for questions. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Abhay. Well, you're leaving me even more optimistic. I totally get it's a very special environment, a war. And I get also that probably the expansion of the workforce might have contributed to what we're seeing, but you're just now showing it's not just the transmission between fathers and daughters, but also kind of broader, right, communities, which is very interesting. So I'm going to ask a question in the chat, which I presume the answer is no, but the question is, do you have any data on ethnicity or race or any other demographic characteristics?
We do actually. Yeah, we do. And the truth is that most of the change in female, most of the change in female labor force participation within the federal government was being driven by white women because these were mainly sort of relatively high status white collar clerical jobs. And so, at least in terms of sort of the selection piece, we think that this is a story mainly about white women entering the government workforce. It's worth actually mentioning that just a few years before World War I, Woodrow Wilson had segregated the federal government along racial lines. That's actually the project that brought us to this data source was a project that looks at segregation of the civil service, and so actually by the time the U.S. enters World War I, the sorts of jobs that were sort of opening up to women had more or less been, in some cases, vacated, it seems, by Black civil servants, mainly male, but also some female. It's worth, I suspect one reason for the question, though, is, or one sort of related part of the question, rather, is, are there different effects on the kids, on sort of kids of different races and ethnicities? And that's not something that I believe we've checked, and so that, or we've looked at, so that's worth looking at. But I don't know if I was sort of putting words in the questioner's mouth, actually, so I apologize if that.
I think the question was very broad,
okay.
Very generally interested. That's so interesting. I did not think you would have that data available. Was it based on names that you would infer ethnicity?
Similar to, I mean, we can infer with more confidence using names for women. And so when it comes to inferring race, we think it's a little bit more important to sort of validate the exercise using the sort of exact matches to the census. But again, one unique feature of our data is that we have sort of place of birth, which allows us to predict a person's race with a little bit of confidence.
No, very interesting. Maybe a last question. We're almost out of time. Are there any discontinuities? So there is research on critical mass, kind of suggesting, right, exposure to one, or is this just kind of linearly increasing? The more exposed I am to women, the more likely I am going to have my daughter work, or is there some nonlinearity in this transition mechanism?
That's a terrific question. I'm just going to pull up the slides one more time. Is there a graph on the slides? On the
Yes.
Yeah. So this is sort of showing exactly, I think, whether and what and I think we didn't have a strong prediction on this, but it does seem to us, at least, that the effects are really being driven by offices that have bigger changes. And I think I think that's consistent with, I think there are certainly studies out there that sort of suggest that moving from sort of 0 to 1%, of a particular excluded group is less likely to have an effect than moving from 0 to 20% or something like that. We are admittedly sort of stretching the data quite a lot here, and so that's why I think that we're losing a lot of precision, as in these different sort of quantile bins. But to the extent we can push it, it really seems like the effect is being driven by those offices that had sort of greater changes.
So Abhay, there's just a very last question that came in. I'm going to speak very quickly because we literally have 1 minute left, but it's an important one. It's just speculation. I think there's 2 questions in the question. One is, other big life-changing events such as COVID, would we expect something similar? And do we fear that a rapid decrease in women's workforce participation might have the reverse effect?
I guess
you can also just say you don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I will say that, one thing that I think is worth noting is that the base from which we were starting in 1915 is probably a little bit worse in the sense of sort of gender egalitarianism, I think, than although Iris, you would know better than me than where we are.
There's growth. There's potential for growth.
Yeah, and so I would hope that the growth that we've had or the changes that we've had in terms of changing norms around work would buttress to some degree against negative shocks. But the truth is, I really
don't know. No, it's a good question, but I don't think we know at this point. But thank you so much. This was very interesting, and again, made me at least somewhat more hopeful, understanding that this was a very, very specific situation and very low workforce participation rate by women. But thank you for joining us today. And to wrap us up, Thank you all for joining us. We'll have our last seminar next Monday. We'll be joined by Professor Elizabeth Linos, who is going to talk more about the question of kind of wrapping it all together in some ways of when do organizations adopt some of the evidence that we discussed in the seminar and that is out there more broadly. And we look forward to have you join then. And in the meantime, have a great week. Thanks again for joining us.